Watercolorist Robbie Laird works as an informed, intuitive painter. She strives to create the feeling of spontaneity while always remaining in control. In this workshop, Robbie plans a floral painting with careful sketches and color tests, then captures the essence of Miltonia orchids with her free-flowing wet-into-wet technique. She imposes depth and detail by lifting, glazing, and scraping, then adds the energy of line with watercolor crayon. Throughout the workshop, she manages moisture on the paper, brush, and palette to achieve exciting, unpredictable edges while maintaining the major shapes in her original design. Now let's join Robbie Laird in Flowing Florals, the informed, intuitive approach.
Hi, I'm Robbie Laird, and welcome to my video workshop. We're going to be doing wet, flowing watercolor to create a planned, personal expression. Our goal today is going to be to make the painting personal, and the key to that is with the planning. I think back to when I began to paint and what inspired me with watercolor, and I thought it looked like magic. I loved seeing the flowing colors and the way that one color charged into another, or little dots would spread into halos. To me, it really was exciting, and that's what made me want to do it. And it looked simple. It looked like it was the easiest thing in the world. And what I learned was there was a lot behind that that made it possible for it to look so simple. A lot of planning, a lot of getting ready, a lot of knowledge. It's one of those things where you have to practice, practice, practice. But then when you paint, you let go and let it come to you intuitively. I think the term I like best for all of that is to be an informed, intuitive painter. So that's what our goal will be today. Along the road to becoming an informed, intuitive painter, we all are looking for our own style, our own expression. We want our work to stand alone and to be personal and unique. And that's when we start looking for what I like to call our fit, our very best way of painting for us. I think an easy way to think about fit is to do a Venn diagram, the 3 circles. Think of one circle being the fundamentals of design, the basis of which any strong painting is formed. Think of another circle as being that which only I can bring to the painting. My inspiration, my intuitiveness, my individuality, all of those are the I. And the T is what techniques will create an expression that is really what I want to say. When we have all of those working in a painting, what we have is a winner. Everything to create a personal, controlled expression that only I can do. One of the most important things is to get really familiar with your materials, because if you know what they will do, then you don't have to stop and think about it as you're getting ready to paint. I like to set up my colors in a color wheel, so I use a palette that has plenty of mixing space and very wide wells. And the colors, the way I set them up, I've picked 12 so that I have direct complementary colors. And that way, when I know that they will mix to a neutral gray, I know that it only takes 2 colors to get to most of the colors that I want. So when I pick a new color for the color wheel, I always try to find a complement, a pair to go with that, so that I try to add 2 colors at one time. Some are not perfect that way, and some are colors that are just so delicious you have to add them anyway. So I try to leave a few empty places in the palette so that if I'm going someplace that has wonderful color that I don't usually use, like Hawaii with the tropical turquoise waters, I'll put a new color in there just for that temporary time, and then I clean it out so that I have back to my good old friends, my familiar ones. I had an experience of finding the paint that works the best for the way I like to paint, and that is the M. Graham paint. The watercolors that he makes are made with honey as part of the binding in the paint. and it enables him to really pack a load of pigment that's very finely ground. And that combination I found works so well for the wet into wet effect because it takes very little paint and it goes a long way. So when I load up my brush with the gram paint and go onto the wet paper, the colors hold up. They don't wash away and fade out. The ones that I picked to use: azo yellow, quite transparent, cadmium orange, fairly opaque, cadmium red light, also fairly opaque, cadmium red. Then quinacridones are very transparent. Quinacridone rose, quinacridone violet, ultramarine violet, probably the weakest pigment of all. You notice how I'm spending a little more time loading my brush because it takes quite a bit more. A beautiful, transparent blue-violet. Ultramarine blue, much stronger pigment, much warmer color. Cobalt blue. Phthalo blue, very warm, very transparent. Viridian. Viridian is probably the second weakest pigment. So if you want a very transparent dark, the two weak pigments will give that to you. And permanent green light, which is a much stronger pigment and a warmer green. And those are the 12. I've added gamboge, quinacridone red, dioxazine purple, cerulean blue. The last one is phthalo green. The palette that I designed was specifically because of the gram paints. It's because they're extra soft that they require a little different kind of a palette. And I wanted one that would be sturdy enough for travel and hold enough of the paint that it wouldn't be moving around and dripping while I was traveling. So I designed a palette that has deep wells, wide wells for big brushes, which I like to use, and that has removable parts so that when I want to save mixtures of colors and use them again, I can, or if I'm out in the field and I want to have a second palette to work in, I have one that's easy to set up right beside me. So the wells that I have are deep enough for the gram paints, and if I let them sit out overnight to just get dry enough, then they don't run in the palette. The paints do have a consistency that stays moist longer than any other watercolors I've worked with. And as I understand it, they were formulated so that you can leave it uncovered, and in the studio I generally do this. And then just with a little spritz, they not only get the top layer soft, the moisture is consistent through the paint. So they've been formulated so that you can continue to use them with a heavy loaded brush, even when the paint has been out for a long time. Consequently, when I fill the wells, I fill with almost a half a tube of paint, because the more paint that is in the well, the longer it will stay in good shape. And after I've finished painting for the day, if it's a little bit mixed up or messed up on the top with other colors, what I do is I let that dry. And then the next day, I can lift that off with a damp brush, and I'm back to pure color underneath. The brushes that I have chosen to use, because they work really well for the effects I like, are the Connoisseur brushes, and these are made by the C2F company. And they're a wonderful blend. The favorite brush of all, if I could only own one brush, would be this one. This is an 1.5" square wash sable mix brush. And what I like about it, it has the advantage of having the sable, the red sable, that has wonderful holding power. The natural bristle has little barbs on it so that it holds the paint. And so it holds a lot of paint. the sable has the best spring of any of the natural hairs, so it has the best memory for springing back to where it belongs. But what makes this brush unique and even better than pure sable is that it has a taklon. The taklon is a synthetic, and it has perfect spring. These are my favorites because of the way I like to paint, and I think we all have to find materials that are our favorites because of the way we want to express ourselves. When we decide what to paint, we should pick something that we are really passionate about. When we pick something, it should be something that is really meaningful to us, that we want to express something about. I happen to love flowers, and so that's something that I pick. I have experiences from my childhood, and when I see them, I think about how temporary they are. You have to capture a flower or enjoy a flower in the moment because it won't be there very long. And because of that, I want to pick a way to express what I feel about flowers that is appropriate. So I want to pick a design that will really emphasize the transient nature of flowers, the temporary existence of flowers. I also want to pick a way to paint that expresses that isn't labored and lengthy, but is very free and immediate. So I'm thinking about all of those things that will be appropriate when I plan what it is that I'm going to paint. Most of my resources come from a lot of sketching because I want to be very familiar with my subject when I start. So every place I go, I sketch. I do lots of painting and sketching in Hawaii, and so I have lots of sketches of orchids of different kinds. Flowers are very short lifespan, and so the expression of them that I want to do is about that movement of time, that short lifespan. So how can I do that with the different materials that I've gotten familiar with and with the different techniques? Well, one of the ways is to pick a design that will express the opening of the flower, the radiating of the flower, and one of the ways is to pick colors that will express the translucency of light coming through the petals of the flower. And another way is to create a format for the painting that allows it to look as if the flower is expanding beyond the borders because it's so full of life. So those are the things I will try to incorporate in my expression of that flower. Often one of the sketches that I've done has a lot of the element that I want, and it certainly has a lot more emotion than a photograph, although I do use photographs for remembering detail. But when I take a sketch from my sketchbook to use as the basis of a painting, I often need to make corrections or changes to make it a better design for an enlarged painting. So what I'll do is sometimes make a copy out of my sketchbook, a copy on my printer, maybe several copies from the sketchbook to decide which one that I'm going to use. And then I want to enlarge that to see what some of the design problems might be in an enlarged form. One of the things I've recently learned is how to make an enlargement on my printer. In this case, I clicked on what's called number 9, poster, and what I ended up with was the same sketch, now enlarged to 9 segments. When I look at the enlarged image, I can decide whether this is going to work as a design for a painting, and if I need to make any adjustments or corrections. Actually, my preference is to put a piece of vellum the size of the paper I'm going to use and do the drawing right on the vellum. And the reason I like to do it the full size is because already my body is starting to get some sense of how large that brushstroke is. And if I haven't done that with a practice with the drawing to start with, then if I'm doing it for the first time, I might not load my brush with quite as much paint. I might not realize how much I'm going to need to carry all the way down there. So the kinesthetic memory is starting as I'm working with the full-size drawing. In addition to my sketches, I have photos that I refer to mostly for color or for detail that I might not have captured when I was doing my sketch. Most often, I don't paint from a photo because in a photo, things are not emphasized that were more important to me, and I want to express more of an emotion than a literal depiction. But I do have the photos for color and for some of the details I might have forgotten. The paper that I'm using, and that is my favorite for the wet into wet, is the Arches 300-pound cold press. And the reason that it has become my favorite is because it really can withstand a whole lot of torture. You can do a lot of soaking, you can do a lot of scraping, lifting, and it still has a lot of resiliency. So that's the paper that I'm using. What I do for the format, in order to accentuate the length, I'm going to take off about 4 inches. So on the back side of the paper, I'll just make a few marks indicating 4 inches. And so that I don't cut into my drawing board, I have another piece of paper that's going to be slipped right along that line I'll be cutting on. Now I'm not going to cut through because what I want is to create the effect of a deckled edge. Sharp knife. I've recently put in a new blade, and I'm just drawing it across, not pushing hard, but drawing it across fairly lightly. But I can hear that it's cutting, and I can see a score. Then I'll move it off to the edge and bend along that score so that I have a nice straight fold. And what's happened, I only want to bend it one way. What's happened is the paper has been cut through partially, and part of it is still intact. So this side is only bent. This side is actually cut. Then when I am ready to tear, I'm going to put the straight edge on the side that I want to preserve the decal. If I put it on this side and tear it, I'll have a decal on this piece. But by putting it on the side where I want the decal to be, then as I lift and use the straight edge as a guide, I'm now tearing through the part of the paper that didn't get cut and getting an uneven edge. So you can see that it is thinner in that area that was left, and if that's not quite uneven enough to create the decal, I can peel a little bit more of that off by hand. And what happens is you're left with a thinner edge, an uneven edge. And then if you should decide to float mount the painting, it has the appearance of the handmade edge all the way around. Now, I like this format because it's more dramatic, whether it's used horizontally or vertically. I've used a piece of drafting vellum, which is heavier than a tracing paper for the drawing, because it's also very forgiving. It allows me to do a lot of erasing and correcting until I get the drawing the way that I want it. Now I've already put the drawing that I decided on a piece of the drafting vellum. And at this point I just check to make sure that it's going to fit, that I have the paper the right size, and even if it's a little bit off, it won't matter. If I want to line it up perfectly, I will tape the paper to the board and tape the drawing to the board as well. The graphite paper comes in rolls or sheets of different sizes, and in order to have it be the size I want, I tape several pieces together. And I save these because they can be used over and over. So I have different ones of different sizes. I'm going to get it lined up the way that I want. And I'm going to use a colored pencil to transfer. It's nice to have part of the drawing transferred onto the paper so that I have a position where I'm going to do the wet into wet. So I'm not going to transfer the whole drawing. I'm going to start right here in the middle. And I use a colored pencil because this enables me to know where I have been, what has been transferred, and what hasn't been. And I can make minor corrections as I go. And after I've done a little bit, like these 3 petal shapes, with my hand holding it in place, I'm going to look and see if it's transferring. And it is, but it's transferring very lightly. So now I'm going to apply a little harder pressure and see if that's the right amount. That line is easier to see. So depending upon how soft your pencil is that you're using, the amount of pressure is important. And it's important to check partway through because you don't want to have the whole drawing done and then realize that you can't see what you've traced. Even more important, you want to make sure that the graphite is turned face down to your watercolor paper. I've transferred a whole drawing and had it end up on the back side because I didn't check that. Now I'm not going to transfer the whole center of the flower. I just am indicating where it's going to be, but not all the detail. It used to be I'd get offended when people would say, "Oh, your paintings look like a happy accident." And I thought, that's not an accident. I mean, it took me a long time to be able to create that effect. And I think that what we want is that feeling of juicy spontaneity, but we want to know we were in control so that we could get what we wanted. I don't find it as offensive any longer. Just getting the placement of these flowers. I didn't tell you what these are. These are an orchid. The name is Miltonia orchid. And I fell in love with them in Hawaii because they have little faces that are sort of like pansy faces. These flowers in the background are not going to be as prominent, so I'm doing just a few lines to get them in place. As I said, if I wanted it to be precise, I could tape everything down, but at this point I really don't want precision. I just want an indication. In laying this out, I decided on the radiating structure as an expression of the springing forth of life. I also didn't want your eye to just go right off the paper. So what I did was I put the flowers in more of a circular arrangement that also goes a little bit off the page, but because of the way that it's composed, it looks as if it's a continuous circle that will come back around. This leaf helps us to come back around. So the radiating structure that will underlie this painting is the underlying abstract design. The secondary structure is the circular that will keep us in the painting. I also like that as a metaphor for the life of the flower because the radiating is the bringing forth of the life. The circle is more like the cycle of the flower. From the bud, if this one is a bud, and this one is a flower that is past, then these would be the ones in full bloom, and it's a cycle of the flower. Having transferred just the major parts of the design, now I'll take off the vellum. And the thing that's nice to know is I still have my drawing. If something happens to this painting, I can do it again. Now the pencil that's left there is a graphite, and what I want to do is dust any loose graphite off with a Kleenex to make sure that it's not going to be floating in the water when I start painting. And then the other thing that I would probably do in this case, the pencil is quite dark, is I'm going to lightly erase this pencil line now that you've seen it, so that it will be lighter when I put this into the water and I won't have as much trouble lifting the line later. I like to use a kneaded eraser. It lifts the graphite without disturbing the surface of the paper. but it still will be there for a guide. This is going to be just about perfect when I get it erased a little. I'm lifting enough of the graphite that the pigment should do the trick as far as covering enough of the line. Now the eraser also leaves a little bit of a residue, and so I'll want to be sure to brush or knock all of that off. The paper needs to be really wet for Wet into Wet to really work. One of the things I've found is I need to buy myself time. So I use a piece of plexiglass, and the plexiglass board is what I will be painting on. And it holds the water into the paper so that I'm not just wetting the surface of the paper, I'm wetting it all the way through, and the plexiglass keeps it from evaporating on the bottom. It holds the water in the paper. So I'm going to take the paper into a tub of water and rotate it back and forth. Of course, if you have a bathtub, that works well. But what I want to do is get it more than wet. I want it to be saturated all the way through. And a frequently asked question is, well, how long do you leave it in the water? And I can't answer that because every place is different. The level of humidity is different, and the paper itself has different sizing in it. Now this paper is not ready, and the way I can tell it's not ready is because it still has spring. It still wants to bounce back. And what that tells me is that the inside of the paper is very dry, and it's only the surface that's gotten wet. If I were using 140-pound paper, if I were doing the practice papers, it would take a lot less time for the soaking. If you have a small space, you can roll it up. Okay, that's getting quite relaxed. So that's ready to work now. I could leave this for a little while. I wouldn't want to leave it overnight in the water because it gets so limp and so saturated. But another thing happens. The sizing starts to dissolve into the water. And it's fine to have in this case, the external sizing. It's fine to have some of that dissolving. But what I'm really depending on is that internal sizing in the paper that's going to stay there and help the pigment to stay on the surface and not soak in. Okay, now what I need to do is to get the paper ready to come up on the plexiglass. So I'm going to have my plexiglass vertically and slide the paper out of the water and up onto the plexiglass. Now on the plexi, I can check to see if there are any air bubbles. If I look on the back of it, well, this time there's only, I can see two. I can see one here and one here. And so what I'll do is I'll just use a large brush to try to squeeze the air bubbles out. The reason I want to do that is that I don't want that area to be drying. And I also don't want it to create a mound so that the paint will not flow evenly. Right now that one's not relaxing. So what I need to do is lift it, make sure there's enough water down there, and then smooth it down, applying pressure with the brush, just as if I was applying wallpaper or something of that sort, to get it nice and flat and to get the moisture evenly distributed. Now to make sure that I don't have puddles around the edge, I'm going to take a paper towel and just dry the edge so that there's not extra water accumulating that will come back onto the painting. Now before starting with the water, I wanted to make sure that my paints were ready, my brushes were ready, and everything is ready to go, because if I have to stop now to get anything, this is a bad time because I need to have lots of moisture in the paper, and I'm buying myself time with the plexiglass. Now because I'm not trying to do a perfect photo image, I'm only going to refer to my photos when I need information. I'm not going to be trying to get detail at this point. What I am going to do is start putting some of the lightest colors directly onto the paper. And in this case, I'm just putting them in areas that will be leaves, leaf shapes. Even in some of the areas where I didn't sketch any leaves. And if it starts to flow over some of the petals, that's not a problem. Because I don't know if you noticed, but when I first put the brush down, the color was very intense, highly saturated. As I moved along, the brush is picking up water from the surface of the paper. So the color is getting lighter and lighter value as I kept going. So I have no need to go back and get more water. All I need is more pigment. Now the next time I go in, I'm going to add a little bit of the green, in this case it's permanent green light, to one side of my brush, which is a double loading of the brush. I'm building to the light greens now. I'm letting it flow right across the line. The line is there just for a guide. It's not meant to be a specific leaf. It's meant to be a guide for a leaf. Now I'm down to very light value once again. This time I'm going to go to something warmer. I'm going to go into the transparent red, which is the quinacridone red, and then I'm going to blot some of it with the damp paper towel that I already used. Blot some of it off of my brush because I don't want too much pigment at this point. But I want a light value color that I'm just going to blend into some of the areas with some of the azo yellow that was there from before. At this point, the painting is getting what I like to call the underlying abstract design. And it's being unified with all of the wet into wet watercolor, but I'm still working on the whole painting, not just on what's going to be background. It's to unify the whole painting. See how light that value became? I started with it fairly light. It got even lighter as I went because it picked up more water as I went. I'm going to go back and get a little more of the quinacridone red. Take a little of it off of my brush so that it's not too intense. Put it into some of the areas to try to unify the whole with this nice warm glow behind the flowers. This is all very light value. But I wanted to knock down the white throughout. The only place I've really left white is where the flowers are going to be. And with wet into wet, if we get too much pigment, too much water, it moves too quickly. We can lose our white very quickly. So I like to preserve the white as long as I can and try to save a larger piece of white than I'm actually going to need. Now I'm going to build toward a little darker values. I'm going to go back and do some of the greens. This is, again, the permanent green light. A good way to learn about greens is to take one basic green and mix a little of one other color with it all the way around the wheel. So mix a little bit of permanent green light with azo and get a beautiful yellow-green. Then try a mixture of permanent green light with a little bit of cadmium orange, and you get a more toned-down green. As you get around to the other side, we're going to use what I'm doing now, and that's almost the complementary color, which is quinacridone rose, and now it's a green that's more believable. But I don't need to have a lot of different tubes to do that. I just need to get to know the ones that I have. I'm going to add just a tiny bit of water to that because my paper is getting a little drier. I'm going to mix a larger amount of that color with the permanent green light, quinacridone rose, because I want some of the same color used in several places throughout the painting to continue with the feeling of unity. I'm going with a deeper and deeper value by having a higher saturation of color without adding water to it. There still is plenty of water on the surface of the paper. Now when I get a gradation from one color to the other, that's one of the things that's beautiful about the wet into wet. I'm again double loading the brush with more green on one side, more of the quinacridone rose on the other side. I'm almost getting a dry brush effect there, and that's a clue to me that my paper is starting to dry in that area. So what I want to do at this point is spray. Now normally when paper starts to dry and you spray, you get little freckles or speckles of light. And that's from drops of water moving the pigment away. If I do this while the paper is still quite wet from underneath, I won't get those speckles because I still have a lot of water coming up from underneath that's keeping the moisture even. Back to my color mixtures. And the colors that I've chosen to be my best friends are ones that are all light fast. And there may not have been a leaf there in my drawing, but I just needed one to be there. And what's fun about painting in an informed, intuitive way is that I have enough information from what I've done before that as I find something in the painting that says do this, I feel free to do that in a way that I know it will go with the painting. I know a leaf shape. I know what goes with the orchid because I've drawn them a number of times. So I'm not just painting out of thin air. I'm painting with stored information that becomes part of the design. Now see how light these colors that looked so dark. Now these are becoming quite light. So I'm building now to a little darker value. And this time I want to change and add another color. Actually, I like this mixture. I'm going to put a little bit of this in and then I'm going to change. I stopped a little bit before the petal and here the same way. So that if it creeps, it won't creep too far onto the petal. If it creeps part of the way, that's okay. But I don't want it to completely obliterate that space that's going to be petal. So I stop a little bit away and allow it some space to flow, because that's what's so exciting. I'm going to mix a little bit of ultramarine blue to cool down that green. And I'm going to put some little pockets of that color. Not everywhere, but in a few places. I'm going to add some to this leaf because this one's getting to be way too light for my liking. I'm going to add some to the underside of this leaf. Notice how many times I've gone back into the water? So far, just to get a little tiny bit for mixing the color, but not to wash my brush and not to add water. A common problem with wet into wet, now I am going to wash it, is washing out the brush and loading it up with water because we're used to doing that. But when we want to control wet into wet and not have it get out of control, we want to reduce the amount of water on the brush, have the water be on the paper, and then mostly it's pigment on the brush. I'm going to switch brushes, and I'm going to move these colors to the side because I might want them again. And I'm going to switch to a round brush, and I need clean water because I want to go to yellow. Sometimes I just reverse these so that I don't dip into the wrong one. Again, moisture is the key. How much moisture on the brush? I don't want too much, but I want enough to pick up a load of azo yellow. I couldn't do this at the beginning when I did the yellow because now I'm going to work on the centers of the flowers. And at the very beginning, there was so much water on the paper that the yellow would have spread throughout the flower, which is not what I wanted. Consequently, what I'm doing is getting a load of pigment that has very little water in it, just enough to make it spreadable. I waited until the surface of the paper does not have a puddle. It still has a sheen, but not a puddle. And now I have more control of the wet into wet. And it's going to spread, and that's okay. So don't worry about that. It's going to spread across the line, but it's not going to spread throughout the entire flower. I want it to do some spreading because part of the energy of the flower is that it is spreading. It's not hard edge. Flowers are very soft. Now to break up the color a little bit, I'm going to add a little bit of gamboge to warm it up. I'm going to put some little pieces of this over here, even though it's not really a center of a flower. Put it over there just to create the same feeling throughout, a little bit of unity in that yellow. At this point, I'm going to put just a tiny bit of the same quinacridone red that I used in the background, just a few little pieces of it to create more of a sense of unity. It's waiting for the right timing with wet into wet. Now what I'm noticing as I'm looking at the paper, most of it still has a nice sheen to it. Over here it's getting to be very dull. So I know that it's still wet enough underneath that I can spray that. At first I might get some little water speckles, but there's enough water underneath that pretty soon it will even out and those will disappear. Same down here. It's a little bit dull. So you can see this is what comes from practice. The first time you do it, you forget those things and you end up with one area getting too dry. But the more you do it, the more you start watching all of those things. Now right here, I'm getting what's called a blossom. This is dull, this is shiny. It's uneven wetness. This is getting drier, this is still wet. So this water is starting to move into that pigment and picking it up as it goes. That's a bloom or a blossom. It's happening here too. And in some cases you don't want that to happen because it can be disturbing. But if you know what's causing it, sometimes it's fun to use that effect. I happen to like it right there. I think it's a wonderful effect because that's the edge of that flower. And it has kind of feathered edge, ruffled. And here along the edge of the petal, it's really quite nice. So I might leave that one there. But if I don't want it, I could spray this area so that it will be damp again and it will even that out so that it would lose that edge. Now I'm going to go back to the larger brush. And in this case, I'm going to stay with my warm-toned water because I'm going to get into the petals. And the petals, I'm going to use a bright, transparent color. And the quinacridone colors are great for this because they are so transparent. They are ground really, really fine, which makes them much more transparent colors. I'm going to start with quinacridone rose. And again, the paper, I've waited to do this until the paper is not as wet. And as I put the paint down, it's still going to move, but it won't move as much as it did in the very beginning. See how it softly moves toward that green. I'm picking which petals I'm doing because I want to do some of the secondary petals, not the two major petals. In a minute, I'm going to do the major ones. And I want it to flow. I want it to have that energy. I'm going to mix a little bit of the yellow in with this, just so the next time I do it down here, it's slightly different. I'm doing repetition with variation, which is much more interesting to the eye than if every time I go back with the color, it's exactly the same. Now I'm going to work on the major petals. That's a really wonderful luminous color, and it's doing exactly what I had hoped it would do. Now I'm going to go back with that same color, quinacridone rose, but I'm going to dip a corner of the brush into the dioxazine purple. Now that's one of the strongest pigments, so it doesn't take very much of it. Now I can feel that the brush feels dry. Yes, I can feel that there's not quite enough, so I'm going to put more pigment, quinacridone rose on one side, dioxazine purple on the other. Now it feels like it has enough pigment. And part of that is that it has enough pigment that I can feel it down into the brush. It's not just on the very tip of the brush, but it's down into the brush. So I know there's a heavy enough load that when I start, I'm not going to stop halfway through and run out of paint. Just leaving a little bit of white showing so that it can blend together on its own. This is where it's nice that the brush comes to such a sharp edge, because then I can go back and put in a few little lines. And they aren't going to be hard lines because it still is wet, which means as long as the paper's wet, whatever I do is going to end up very soft. Now I want to work on these, but I wanted those to be the most intense. I see one little part of a petal that I forgot over there. These are starting to get dull. So are the leaves. So I'm back to my spray bottle again. If I were to pick this paper up now and show you the back of it, it would be shiny and glossy just like it was when we started, because the plexiglass is holding the water in from the back. So it's staying really wet. That's buying time for me to do these things. I don't know how easy it is to see, but some of these wonderful little halo glows that are forming with the paint still feathering out into the damp and wet areas are some of the beautiful things that I love about watercolor. Over here I don't want it to be as intense, and if it turns out to be, I may stop and go back and, oh, but that's so pretty. May stop and go back, I was going to say, and tone it down, but I may just leave it for now. I can tone it down later. Those juicy effects are the ones we go, oh, wow, look at that. And I think that some of the first watercolors I ever saw had these effects and made me want to paint with watercolor. As a kid, I painted in oil, and I thought that was the way to go. But I didn't realize that it could be so much fun to not know exactly where each little bit of paint was going to go. And in oil, it always went right where I put it. In watercolor, I can learn to control where it goes, but still be surprised. Each of us has different ways that we add our own signature to a painting. And a signature is something that just becomes yours, the way that you move a brush, the way that you add the color, the kind of line you put into it. And I like to use scraping, and the brushes that I use all have this wedge on the end of them. And I've come to love that, because if I have a brush in my hand and I want to do a scraped technique, I can scrape it, move the pigment, and use the handle of the brush. I don't have to have another tool. I'm scraping, I don't know if it was clear, but I'll do it again. I'm scraping and rotating the handle at the same time. So I'm starting with the handle pretty much parallel, not entirely, pretty much parallel. By the end, it'll be up vertical. So I'm scraping and rotating at the same time. Now the reason for that is that as I scrape with it down, it's more squeegee-like. As I pull it up, it pulls the paint along. So if I scrape it and it removes the paint, then I bring it up and it makes a little groove for the paint to flow into. If I wait too long, I can't do this. Now right here, if you can see the little grooves, they turn dark because I'm making a little dent in the paper and the pigment is flowing into that. The variety between scraping for the light ones and then grooving, or it's almost like creating a little trough for the dark ones, is a nice repetition with variation. This is to continue the feeling of motion and flow, and I'm going to want to do that continuous from here to here. So I'm going to start this one going down this way because I want it to scrape. Then I'm going to go this way to continue that feeling across. Now I'm going to make some of the little grooves for the darker lines. Now if I want to have a really broad scrape, then a palette knife of this sort works well. This works actually better than a metal one because the metal is too hard on the paper. And this one gives a nice flat, I'm going to use the small side here, nice flat scrape. I can do the same kind of thing with it. It's so much fun you can get carried away. I could keep going because it's so much fun to do the lines, but it's important not to do too many. And the larger scrapes will help give a repeat without it being as repetitious. I'm going to give a slight spritz to the center of the flowers. I want to give the little dots that will become the little halos. So I'm going to spray that just lightly. I don't want too much because I waited to do it when there wasn't as much water on the paper. But I can control the amount with the spray bottle. And now I want a brush that has a really nice point. And I'm going to use a mixture of the dioxazine purple and a little bit of quinacridone violet to warm it up just slightly. So I need a pointed brush because I don't want to put too much down. And I'm going to make the little dots of the center. I want them to be soft, but I want them to be distinct. So the control in that comes from waiting until the paper is not soaking wet and making sure that I don't have much water on my brush. Mostly pigment and just enough water to get the pigment loaded onto my brush. And these are starting to spread just about right. Little spidery fingers going out into the damp area. I think they're gorgeous. Just a few to repeat. These flowers, of course, are not as important as these. My most important flower is here, secondary here, and these are second to those. So I try to pay more attention, give more time and detail to the ones that are the most important. Now I'm going to mix a little warmer, that means more of the violet, more of the quinacridone violet, and I don't really need any more of the dioxazine purple. But this is going to be for the area close to the center, but it's into the yellow area as well. I didn't want to do it too soon because I know that when you mix complementary colors, the yellow and the violet, you end up with gray. I don't want neutral gray in the middle of my flower. So I waited. I still want it to be soft and to move, but I didn't want them to mix together to a neutral gray. So I waited until the yellow would no longer move and mix. When I'm painting flowers, I've decided not to use the opaque colors because I think that the translucency of the petals themselves really ask for transparent colors. So I use quinacridone colors and not cadmium colors that are more opaque. When you look at a petal of a flower and hold it up to the light, you can see the little pockets of water in the petal. And that light coming through the water in the petals is the effect that I want to achieve. So I stick with the transparent colors as much as possible. I also like to add the energy of line in a different way. And so I use Caran d'Ache, which is a watercolor crayon, to add more lines to the painting. Lines on top will flatten a painting so it looks more like a painting and not like reality. But that's okay with me because I am painting an expression, the essence of the flowers, a feeling more than a literal depiction. Today I haven't had any trouble with a crawl back around the edge because the painting has been drying enough. But sometimes you have to be very aware that if it stays wet and the backside is very shiny and wet and the surface is now getting dull, the water will crawl back around the edges and pretty soon I'll have a little white edge with all the pigment moving away. So in order to avoid that, when you're finished with the wettest stage, take the painting off of the plexiglass and put it onto a board that is unfinished. It's important that it's unfinished so that it will start to absorb the water from the back side of the paper. And after a little while, I'll probably turn the board over and have it absorb more of the water. The key to keeping it flat is having even moisture throughout the paper so that as the top starts to dry, it's going to start to change shape. When I can flip the painting over if I need to, let the back dry a little bit. The Caran d'Ache goes on like crayon, and it's just a nice way to add another element of line while the painting is damp. There you can see it a little bit. It goes on fairly easily. You can put it on when the painting is absolutely dry. It goes on like crayon. You can completely peel off the side and rub it like crayon. I'm not going to do that this time. But then the other thing that's fun about it is adding the color with the Caran d'Ache that reflects the color that you did with the paint. So this is some of that same quinacridone rose color. And I can put it in little pieces as a line that's drawn on. I can also add it with dots that don't spread, dots that stay put. And then just to add some gestural lines or marks that break up the surface and add an interest that wasn't there. adding a little bit of the complementary color to the green areas. And complementary color to green is red. Makes it come alive. If you have a whole area of foliage that's all green, variations of green, 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 with no relief for the eye gets very tired of that. So adding little pockets of the complementary color breaks that up and makes it visually more interesting to look at so that it becomes more lively. Now, another thing that is kind of fun to do with the crayons is to put dots or lines on the dry surface and then to spray it, because they will move as well. Now, if I don't want everything to move, if I like what I have above it, I can protect an area and just spray what I want to move. See how they're starting to diffuse and move a little bit? That makes them look like they're more part of the wet into wet painting. And it's a way to add some details and then soften them. It's moving just enough. So some of them can be definite, some of them can be softened. If I had a clean finger, I could have blended that a little better. I think I'm going to add a little more of the purple to the edge. I'm going to do some more painting as it gets dry, but with the Caran d'Ache, it has a different quality about it, a soft addition of color. It can be blended in. And then when I get some of the color down in a way that I want it, I can make it seem even more blended in by adding water with a brush. Because the pigment, now that it's wet, will move. I can blend it in. Play back and forth between the dry and the wet. It's tempting to continue on at this stage, but this is the perfect stage to make sure that the painting is absolutely dry before I go on, because as I add to it now, I want more definition. And to get more definition, I need the paint to not be moving, to not be sliding across into the next color. I need to be able to carve an edge and define it. And so this is when I really need the painting to be dry. When I look at these greens, I want some of them to come more forward and some of them to recede more. And so one of the best ways to do that is with a glaze of either yellow or blue. And so I'll take clean water and a little bit of azo yellow. Now here's where there's a lot of risk in wet into wet, because my paper is damp. It's very damp. I have some areas that are still shiny where I just sprayed it. And if I start putting wet paint onto damp paper, I'm going to get a lot of uncontrolled blossoming. So in order to control that, I need to have the moisture in the brush be equal to what is on the paper. So I want the color, I want the yellow, but I don't want it, and I want it to be light, so I get the mixture I want. I don't want the brush to be sopping wet, because if I put a wet brush down there, I'm going to end up with a blossom where I don't want it. What I'm going to do is put some yellow on this leaf. So I'm going to take a lot of the moisture out of the back of the brush, leaving just pigment and moisture on the end of it, and I get a nice glaze of yellow that's not too wet, so it won't be moving all over where I don't want it to be. So it's a nice glaze, bringing the yellow tends to optically make it come forward a little bit. going to do that on the edge right here. I could do this after it's completely dry. I don't have to do that at this point because anytime a glaze can be added, and the main thing to do to control it is to make sure that this wet edge and damp edge don't blend together, because that's where I'll get a blossom that I don't want. So I'm blotting just a little bit of it to make that transition from drier to wetter more gradual. So in the end, all of these things that look like they are happy accidents took a lot of planning. Okay, now I just did something I didn't want to do, but I did it at a stage where it's easy to do something about it. Take a Kleenex and just lift that glaze that I just put on there, blot it right up into the Kleenex, back to what it was before. The paint tends to stay on the surface and enables a lot of change because the paper was full of water, so it's not letting the paint soak as far down in. I want these stems to come forward a little bit more, but in order to control where the color goes, I'll do more of this after it's dry, but I'm going to take a brush and load it with just clear water and let it go only where I want the color to be. And then I'll put the pigment in just that area. Okay, that one's needing another glaze. Little by little, building it up. Now what we're going to do is let it dry, because as I do some of these after it's dry, they won't soak in at all. They'll stay on the surface. That's enough of the effect for now. So what we're going to do now is take a look at what is working and what we need to do to strengthen this painting and tighten it up in the finishing stages. At the beginning, when I took off the extra amount of paper, I save those pieces that I trimmed off, and those become what I call test strips, so that I can try out colors, I can make notes to myself, and sometimes while the painting is drying, this is how I spend my time. Testing techniques, trying new things. In this case it was for a different painting obviously, but I was trying some of the same techniques of scraping and adding color, putting colors that are complementary colors next to each other but not letting them mix neutral gray. So test strips are something that I have a whole drawer full of, because when I'm doing different paintings I try different techniques on my test strips, and they're done on the same paper that I'll be painting on. So I get the same feeling that I will have when I'm working on the actual painting. Now, some of the things that I want to do with this painting require that I have more definition. So I'm referring back to my drawing that I've saved. Now the value of this drawing at this point is that it shows me right where I did transfer shapes and the ones that I didn't transfer. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find one of the lines, that it's a pencil line that I can still see, and I'm going to match it to the drawing to get it in place. And I'll find another one down here that matches, so that I'm sliding the drawing around until it is registered along with the painting underneath. Now when I have it in place, then I'll look at what happened through the vellum drawing and see how the drawing that I transferred worked with the wet into wet paint. Now in some cases I can see yellow beyond where I had the center of the flower. I can also see here where I had part of the center of the flower that I hadn't drawn, so I didn't save that as a light space. So I'm checking some of these different areas because this is where I'm now going to need extra detail to be able to finish the painting and emphasize the centers the way that I want to. Also, this leaf, this stem, I didn't put in because I wasn't sure how those were going to play into the painting, and I wasn't sure if I was going to want them. When I have this in place, and I have indicated where I'm going to be doing the detail. Then I'm going to tape. I'm going to tape the painting itself. And this is artist's tape, and it should not bother the surface of the painting if I don't leave it on too long. And then I'm going to tape my vellum drawing so that it stays in the same place. And then I'm going to slip the graphite paper underneath, being sure that the graphite side is face down. I'm going to slide it underneath the vellum. And I'm going to concentrate on the areas that I have designated. Now, I could change to a totally different color. This one's a little bit lighter. I'll be able to see what I'm doing. I have some vellum drawings that I have used and reused. It's really nice to have the feeling that if I get a certain way through the painting and I'm not happy with it, I can start again because I have the drawing I can fall back on. I don't have to start from scratch each time. Now, if the paper is slightly damp, and I think that this still might be slightly damp, then the graphite transfers pretty dark. So I may be pushing a little harder than necessary at this point. I'm adding some of these leaves because I think they added some grace. We'll see how they come out. Okay, I haven't done any of this because I don't think it's necessary, just the shape. It seems like that's enough. Now, one of the things I might do first is to look for any area that I want to lift. And in this case, I'm seeing that I want to lift this stem across here, and I want to lift the edge of this leaf that bled over farther than I wanted. I'll find other places as we go along, but if there are some that are particularly evident, I can do those first. And one of the ways to lift is to use a stencil. And my favorite thing to use for stencils is bacon paper. It's the paper that comes in a package of bacon, but the bacon paper is like a frosted piece of very thin plastic, frosted on one side, clear on the other side. And the frosted side makes it easy to draw on. I like it because you can see the paper. It's not like using a piece of very clear plastic that is easy to misplace or to not get it where you want it. It's nice to have the frosted, but if you have trouble finding bacon paper, another thing that you can use is called shrinkers. Shrinkers is a material that's used in shrink-a-dink, which is a children's shrink art. They draw on it and then they can shrink it into a very small size. It's a heavier weight than what I would generally use. I think this is 2 pieces. But it's a good substitute if you don't have bacon paper. Bacon paper is just slightly lighter weight, and it works a little bit better because of the frosted side. And the way that I use this is to use a permanent marker, a pair of scissors. If I find a line that I want to remove, I draw that on the frosted side. Now in this case, I'm going to be saving this, removing this. So I'm going to cut this away. So all I really need is that line that I've drawn for the edge. Because I'm going to put it right on the edge of that leaf. And I need to have a couple of Kleenex ready, and I need my little scrubby brush. It is called a scrubber, and it's very stiff bristles. And what I'm going to do is hold the stencil in place and I'm going to wet very lightly the area that I want to remove. And let it sit for just a moment. Doesn't matter that the water is sliding under, because I'm not going to be scrubbing on that place. I'm going to scrub away from the edge using clean water. I want to be sure that I have clean water out along the outside so that if it's starting to go into the other area of the painting, it doesn't make it a dark color that I don't want. Now the paint lifts off pretty easily because most of it stayed on the surface of the paper. Now I won't take all of it off this first time round. Now see that a lot of water has bled underneath, but I haven't moved this, so it will be fine. I'm going to take a Kleenex and blot that edge. And then as soon as I take the stencil up, I'm going to blot again. Actually, I'm going to wait 1 minute on that because that's a little piece that will come off. I want that paint to be settled, and it's been sitting there for just a minute. If I blot it right now, I'll take quite a bit of it up, and I don't really want to do that. I like that nice sharp edge. When I use the Kleenex to blot, I want to make sure that it's Kleenex that doesn't have any oil or any lotion in it. So it's an oil-free Kleenex, good old-fashioned kind. I'm leaving some of that. I may or may not remove it later, but this was enough for the first go-round. And I like the edge that I have. These little specks are actually pieces that will lift off later, but I'm going to leave them there to dry for now. So I can sharpen up an edge. I'm going to do this one now that goes through this leaf because I want this stem to come on this side of that leaf. Again, I'm going to brush with the scrubber just to get it wet. I did scrape in that area. Where I scraped, I pushed the paint deeper into the paper so it will not lift as well. But that's really okay. And if there's a little line through it, that won't change the illusion. And blot it again. Now after that's dry and that's dry, if I want to remove some more, I can go back and do it again. But that's enough for right now. If I want to do that in another place, it would be in the center here where I have the little parts of the center of the flower that I did not leave white or yellow. And some of those I would like to lift, so I'll find a piece that I can use for that. Draw the shape with a permanent marker. The part that I cut out is what's going to be light. Now, if I had tried to avoid this when I was doing the wet into wet, if I had tried to paint around this and keep it yellow, I would have had a much tighter looking feeling to this flower. By letting the wet into wet be expressive and flow, and then coming back and lifting it later, I can create much more of that opening of the flower. And I don't want this one to be pure white, although if I kept going, I could get it pretty light. Because the center of the flower has some color, and it also gets reflected color from the petals around it. So I just want to lighten it enough for that shape to take the form that it needs to be a center. I'm going to do a couple more in that area. This one got pretty dark on this side. Now, if it's a little tiny shape that's too hard to get to with the scissors, or if it's an enclosed shape, you might have one of those over here. Then I can use just the point of an X-Acto knife. And I'm rubbing away from the edge toward the opening, so I'm not forcing the water underneath any more than I have to. It's amazing that these quinacridone colors that are so intense lift so easily. And that again is a little piece that's loose. but it's because they're on the surface of the paper, not pushed down in. If the paint stays on top of the paper, wet or dry, you can move it. You can lift it off, or you can get it to move in water on top. I sometimes reuse shapes from other paintings when I find the right one. I guess Laird is a Scotch name, and I'm Scotch by nature. But I have a whole envelope full of shapes that I've saved. And once in a while, you know, I find one that's just right to use again for a little shape that I need. So I might even find one for the edge of a petal later, so I'll leave that out. Okay, when I get those little pieces of light back in where I want them, then that will enable me to finish the center of the flower with the light color that I want to. When I start to add some of the darker areas, I want to do that around the shapes that I've already drawn. So I'm going to go back and get some of the colors that I used before, but make sure that they're very dark pigment. And I'm going to be using 2 brushes, because the way I'm going to do it is to mix one of these wonderful colors with a darker value for the center of the flower. That's one brush. The other brush, I'm going to use clear water. I'm going to start it on this one because I think this one's a little bit drier than the one I just did. And what I'm going to do is to paint around the center shape with clear water. And remember, wherever there is water, the paint will move. So what I want to do is to make sure that the water extends well out into the petal, so that when I put the pigment down, that's the direction that it will move, into the water. It will not move where I've left it dry. So I'm going to have clear water out into the petals. I'm avoiding the area that is in the center of the flower. Now the pigment that I've mixed, I wanted to have it mixed so that while this is very wet and I drop it in, it will have a chance to move and blend with what's already there. If I started mixing the color now, the paper would be drying. And the reason I want it to move into that area that I've made wet is because I want it to look like part of the wet into wet that I did earlier. I'm going to save that color. See how it's still gradually moving, still gradually covering up what was there before. And while it's doing that, I'm going to wet another area over here. This is risk-free painting. Paint with clear water. If you don't like it, just let it dry. Back to the one with the paint on it, and drop it in, and let it move where I have wet the paper. Do a couple more. Now I'm going to do a little more to that, but it's too wet to touch it right now. So I'm moving on to an area that I can paint, and again, the key is not too much water. Right now there's too much water right there. Just want a little bit of water. Down here, a little bit of water. And water extended well beyond where I want it to go. I just want enough water on the surface so that the pigment will not have a hard edge. I want it to have a hard edge, or a very defined edge on one side. I want the other side to be very soft and to blend in with the wet into wet. This is just a little pocket that defines the shape of this piece. Now it doesn't take very many little pockets of dark and details to really define that flower. I want to put one in there, but I don't want it to be quite that dark because it would be too dark for that petal. So what I'm going to do is to get clear water for that. And go around the outside as well so that it will look continuous. Wet this area. I'm going to stay away from that. If I put water in that now, I'd be adding clear water to pigment and I'd get a dot. And this is almost ready for me to do something more to it here. So I'll do this part quickly. Okay, now I didn't have quite enough water to get it to move, so it's staying a pretty defined shape. So what I want to do is to get my brush with clear water again, but not too much water. I want to get it fairly dry because that is not very wet. I'm going to put clear water outside of that. Blot my brush and come up closer so that I can now move it into an area that's wetter and let it diffuse into that petal without having a hard edge. I think it needs a little bit more color in there now. It has a little more space to move. Okay, now this is the perfect time to do the scraping for the petals that needs to come through this dark area. So I'm studying where the shape comes in, where the edge of the petal is, and the center of this one comes right up out of here. Oops. I have to be careful to not put my hand in this wet paint over here. This one comes into the center of the flower here. So I want to continue this line through here and out so that it looks like it belongs. This one's coming up through between these two petals. It doesn't take much, but it needs to be there to show that it all comes from the same center of the flower. I think that's probably enough of that. Now let that dry and do the same thing to this center. I'm going to start by going around the large center part of the flower. I'm doing pigment that is just slightly lighter and drop in just enough pigment to let it blend out into the petal. This is painting around the center of the flower to give shape to it. Some people call that negative shape painting or negative painting. I've always found that a funny term because each little shape is very positive and very important as to the whole. And I like to call it positive because the shapes around are just as important as the shapes that make the flower themselves. That shape. And it blends in with this petal. Gives just a little bit of a hard edge definition there. I'm going to go back and give a little bit more definition to the petals themselves in a couple of places. I like having some of them be diffused, so I'm not going to define everything. I am going to define a few of them just so that there is a difference between hard edge and soft edge, or found edge and lost edge. So in some of these little areas around the petals, I'll use the same colors that I had. In this case, I think I just switched my brushes. This one's now the clean water brush. It really doesn't matter, it's just that it's helpful to have two brushes going so that you can keep clean water and not have to keep washing your brush out and losing all of the paint that you've just mixed. There's a little edge of a petal there, and I'm going to put some of the mixture of quinacridone red and rose together for that. Not much of a definition, just a little bit of definition. And on the other side over here, I'm going to do the same thing clear water and with the same mixture of color. What this is doing is it's leaving a little bit of that loose, spontaneous look, but it's tightening it with a little bit of shape that is defined. And I think that all of us are different in terms of how much definition we want and how much ambiguity we like. While that's getting dry over there, I'm going to jump over here because I'm going to do the same kind of thing to this flower and to the stem of this flower. I'm painting with water. Right now, I did not mix a color first. I'm just painting the stem with water because I want it to be a little bit drier when I put the color into it. But I'm painting with water because I don't want it to be a defined, hard edge of color. I want it to blend together. So within that controlled strip, I want it to be like a little wet into wet painting. So I'm going to start with the azo yellow. Putting the light edge on the top, assuming that there might be more sunlight at the top. And then I'm going to get some of the permanent green light into the mixture. And let that blend. And I'm purposely making little strokes, not one continuous one, because I want it to have places where it blends in different amounts. Little strokes will deposit a little bit of color here and there. If I did one continuous stroke, it would look very even and not as interesting to look at. The eye craves variety. Now I'm going to dip into some of that green that I had mixed earlier that I saved. And I'm going to put a little bit of that in some of the places just to spark it up a little. And it looks more natural to me than if I had painted the whole thing without having the water there first. I need a little bit of definition along the edge. Make the stem look more rounded. The painting leads me and I lead the painting. So I don't always know exactly what the next thing is that I'm going to do. But then when I decide what to do, I'm leading the painting until it tells me what to do next. Now this is a case where it's going to blend in. If it doesn't blend in enough, I can add more water if I want to, but I'm going to let it see what it's going to do. I think it's going to be all right. What I want to do is do some of the definition, the light shadowing that's going to go on the bottom of the flowers here. So I'm going to be mixing a new color for that, and that's going to be mostly ultramarine violet. Now that one's mixed up for use on the edges of these flowers. So I'm going to get back to clean water and paint along the edge. This line is the one that was defined from the first graphite transfer that I did. And I'm just bringing the water up into the flower, not trying to make it a definite shape, because I want it to be soft too. I just want to define the edge of this flower. And I have my mixture of violet, which I'm going to put along the edge. Let it move where it's wet, and it doesn't move where it's dry. But I want it to be a little lighter, so I'm going to add a little more water. In fact, I think I want to change the color a little bit, so I'm going to put some cobalt blue into it just to change it slightly. So that I have a little bit of variation for visual interest. Now this one on purpose, I didn't put as much water because I wanted it to maybe have a little bit more defined edge in some places. And I want this one to stay light in value because I love the little spidery things that are happening and I don't want to obliterate them. Over here, where it's too defined, I'm going to get some clean water. Go up close to it and then touch it. Over here I haven't put any water and I want to do a little bit more there. When I start to do the detail part, I start right in the center of the most important part. And the reason for that is, when I was talking about the ambiguity and specificity, if I start right in the center of the most important part with my detail, and I finish that, I might decide that's enough. And I'm going to leave the rest of the painting ambiguous. And I can do that at any point if I've started with the most important part. If I'm timid and start out on the edge of a leaf and start detailing the leaf and I get it just the way I want, then I have to make the next thing more important. And then I have to make the next thing more important. And if I save the most important thing till last, I'm going to have everything painted in extreme detail by the time I get to the end. And that might be all right, but if I start the other way, start with the most important part first, detail that, at any point, the painting may say to me, you've said enough. You can stop now. And I may decide that I don't want to carry it any further. Now I'm really liking what's happening with the edges of the petals and the way they're being defined. What I want to do is to add a little more dark behind here with the leaves to bring this out, but this is still too wet. Now this is a case where if I wanted to, I could get out a hairdryer and I could dry it and keep going here. But since I know what I'm going to do and I have other things I can do, I'm going to move to one of those and let it dry naturally. Over here I have a flower that has that bottom part that I don't want to have be as important as those, but I want to do something to define it. So I'm going to, again, paint it with clear water. Just a little bit of variation. Because just like when I put the yellow to get things to move forward, I use the blue to get them to recede. And that's probably enough on that one just to give the feeling. I'm going to do a glaze on that leaf that earlier I put the yellow on, and then I decided I didn't want yellow. I wanted blue because I wanted it to recede. So now I'll add the blue. It's not bothering me that it's a blurry leaf. So I'm going to leave it just the way it is and just add a blue glaze to get it to move back a little bit. And this, I think, I'm hoping, is dry enough. So this leaf now is going to go behind. This stem is going to come forward optically. The whole thing is, somebody said, well, it's just tricks. But really what it is, it's manipulation. It's manipulation of the viewer to make the viewer think that something is happening. And we've learned how to do that with optical illusion. When that dries, it will be a lot less vivid. So I'm going to leave it there. And if it is still too vivid, then I can tone it down. One of the things that's hardest to remember is that cool colors, when they are in light value, recede, move way back in the distance. That's why we use them in landscapes for things that are far away. Cool colors, when they are intense and dark value, come forward. So if we have dark blues, they come right up to the front of the painting. So if we're doing water and we want it to look like it's laying down flat, we do dark to light. And the same is true on a subtler sense if we're doing just a short distance, not a long distance. Now the opposite is true of warm colors, because warm colors that are very dark recede. Warm colors that are very dark value go in. This is in short space. So if you look down into the cup in your hand, the color you see is not a cool dark, it's a warm dark. Warm darks are like hot pockets, they recede. Warm light colors will come forward, and that's why yellow comes forward. The warmer light values come forward. Okay, now that I have some of those dark values in the flowers, I'm going to balance it with dark values in some of the leaves behind the flowers to let the flowers be more defined. So I'm going back to the green that I mixed before. I'm going to start using some of it in a few of these places where I used it before. So I'm going to put it around the edges of some of the flowers to help define that shape. And in that little bit of time, that's gotten dry enough. Now that I want to blend in better, so I'll get some clean water. And again, I won't start here because I'll just pull color. I'm going to start clean water down here and move up to it and allow it to go into the clean water. Now I really want that one to pop, so what I'm going to do is put a little pocket of red in there. This is the quinacridone rose. And I'm going to put that hot pocket, hot, warm red, in with the green, which will make that really recede behind that flower. Put a little bit of it right there too. Doesn't look red because it's neutralized. The red and the green make a neutral. But putting the hot or the warm dark makes the flower come forward and the stem go back. Now since this flower is the one that's most important, I've spent more time figuring out how to make it show more. I still need to have it come forward of these areas that are going to be leaves. These are going to be dark, receding more. But I'm going to do those by painting positively. I'm not going to paint around everything. I'm just going to paint around a few pockets and paint the leaves positively. So first, I think it would be best to do the leaf and then do the pockets with the same mixture that I have for the leaf. I'm going to use some of the same mixture on these leaves. Some of it will end up being dry brush because the paper is very dry and I'm not going to wet every bit of it. I'm starting now with a mixture of the azo yellow, permanent green light, for that brilliant color. And in this case, I'm not going to tone it down by neutralizing it. I'm going to tone it down by going slightly to the side of complementary. This is the violet, and it tones it down, but it tones it down in a cool way instead of a warm way. Okay, now before I do dry brush, I do want some of these to be a little softer, so I'm going to, this one's going to be the softer one, and then I'll do the dry brush on the other. So I'm wetting part of it to soften some of it. The color is very strong, and I can go right up to the edge, dry edge of this petal. This is where it's going to get the dry brush effect on the edge. Now that's a dark and potent color, but what it does is it makes the flower just pop out. I'm just going to blend with a little bit of water some of these little spots. And right in here, I don't want too much definition. Playing back and forth between the dry and the wet all the time. Don't want to overdo the use of the dark, but I want it to look integrated into the whole painting. So I'm finding places to use it, and as I go, I'm adding, for variation, a little bit more of the violet. I like the dry brush, but I don't like the harsh edge. So what I'm going to do is add water to give it a little bit softer feeling. But I like the transition between the soft part and the dry brush part. A few more touches, we're getting real close. When I say that, it means that I'm getting to the point where I feel like there's enough said. I could paint for another couple of days on this painting if I wanted to just keep tickling it and embroidering it and having fun with it. And that's what you might do. And that would be perfectly fine, because each of us has a different place where we say, that's enough. And then I'm going to spray to get it to blend in. And when I spray, I don't want this flower to be impacted by the spray. So this flower is going to get protected. I want the edge to be slightly diffused. Not a lot, just a little. And if it starts to move into a place I don't want it to move, I can take a Kleenex and dry that spot. Now this is feathering perfectly. That's exactly what the effect I want. It's in the distance, it's not as defined. It's getting that nice soft edge. This one's a little too defined as well. Perfect. This one's a little too green. So we have to get some blue up there. It's very close to the edge, so I don't want it to be too bright. Things that are too important close to the edge draw the eye too much. And the very last thing that I think I'm craving doing is putting a little more carandache, a few more lines, to just give some energy to the last detail. So I'm going to pick a few of the colors, give it a few more dots and dashes. I see one more thing I have to do. See, if I went away from it, I might have decided it was done. But since I'm still going, I keep finding little things to do. I want to define the center. Just reads as having a shape. This is where it gets to be just totally a personal expression. It could be finished the way it is. It could be detailed a lot more. I could stop without doing this, but this is just so much fun that I want to do this. And someone else might not do this at all, but just the energy of a line applied on top to me, emphasizes that this is an expression. This is not a photograph. This is the way Robbie feels about the Miltonia orchids when they are in full bloom in their cycle of life that isn't going to last very long. And when I add pieces of color that energize the whole surface of the painting, it's giving more expression to that concept. And remembering that the complement to green is red, and if I put little pieces of it in the solid green areas, it will energize the greens in a way that the eye stays interested. I'm not putting lines or defining things per se. I'm just putting pieces of color that add some energy. And that's what makes painting so much fun. And I find that when I watch other artists paint, they may have a style that is totally different from the way that I paint or the way that I want to paint. But I can't think of a single time that I haven't learned something from them that I could add to what I'm doing in my own work. And that's the joy of sharing, of teaching, and of seeing other people's work. The main thing is we have to trust the inner voice, and we have to believe in ourselves, and we have to paint with confidence and conviction and say, this is my expression, and I can do it my own way the best. After I've had a little break and had a chance to get away from the painting, I decided it was time to come back, take a fresh look, and see if there was anything more that I wanted to do with it. And I think that's a really important step, to get away, because we're so used to working at arm's length and not giving ourselves to walk away from a painting and then look at it from a distance to see what it needs. Often, if my painting is dry enough, I'll put it up in a place where when I walk back into the studio, I get a distant view of it, and I get the first visual impact in a new and fresh way that's very different than being at arm's length. Now, having done that, which I did when I came back after a break, there are several things I've decided that I still want to do to this painting without overworking it and without getting rid of the loose, juicy feeling and the emotion. I want to do some things that I think will improve the design, and they're based on what I talked about earlier. The first of those is I want to do a little bit more definition through these petal areas where I can separate one petal from another and give the impression that light is coming through those petals in the way that I talked about, because what moved me when I saw the flowers was that moisture, that light, that aliveness that I could see in the light passing through the petals. I also want to unify the whole painting with more of a definite color feeling, warm or cool. And it already is going toward the warm. I want it to go more toward the warmth of the sunlight coming through those petals and leaves. So I'm going to emphasize the warm colors. In order to define the petals, I'm going to go back to my bacon paper and look at where I want to make a division in the petal so that I can let the sunlight pass behind. And there's already a pretty good division here, but I want to make it a little sharper. So I'm going to make that line a little bit sharper for that petal. Actually, where I had it drawn went this way. The way the wet into wet went was this way, and I like that feeling, so I'm going to use that new line and sharpen that. So this is where the painting is leading me. And then I am going to lead it again to make that a little sharper definition. The other edge of the petal, that was down here, I'm going to sharpen this way. Put this back along the same shape, lining it up with both petals. Now this time, I'm doing it the opposite of what I was doing before because I'm going to be brushing into the petal. So I'm going to get some water out there so I don't have a harsh line. I'm going to now wet against the edge and let it sit for just a moment to soften the pigment. It'll take a little bit longer because it's thoroughly dry from having taken a break. And then I'm going to lighten and sharpen at the same time the edge of that petal. See, when the pigment gets loose, it starts to move with the scrubby brush. I don't want it to be too abrupt, so I'm going to lightly scrub out here and then scrub a little harder right at the edge. Blot that with the stencil on, and then lift the stencil and blot it again. Now I have a lightened edge where the darker petal and the lighter petal are defined. Put water on first, let it sit for just a minute, and blot again. I definitely want an edge lifting. I don't want to do too much of it because the spontaneity of what I did is what I want to preserve. I just want a little bit of light to be recaptured. I like the way that little bit of light is coming through the edge. I'm going to do a little bit more of that. Now I'm seeing an area up here that I did a little too much. I stenciled it down here, and I was not thinking about the shape of this petal that I really wanted to come in front more. So I'm going to have to go back, but I can do that after I've done this lifting. I can go back and add on top of that. I just want to be careful to blend it in so that it doesn't look like a patch. And I know that I used the quinacridone rose, and for the center part I added some dioxazine violet. So I have quinacridone rose, that's a little bit of the quinacridone violet to cool it down, and then the dioxazine purple. Now in order to get it to blend in, I'm going to get a brush with clean water. Now the one thing that is true about the area where I have scrubbed it, the surface of the paper has become much softer and more porous because it's been roughed up. So I cannot paint and get the same effect that I can on the surface that has the sizing. So I'm going to really basically only have one chance to do this because it will start to soak in. So what I'm going to do is soften this edge a little bit right here to get that more blendable. And then I'm going to put the water into this area where I want it to go, a little more down into the shape right here where I lifted it and decided I didn't want it lifted. I'm going to just scrub that edge a little bit so that it's not such a hard edge. And then I'm going to use my color mixture in this area. Get back to this petal. Being a little darker on top. I just want the light on this part of it, not on this part. And then I'm going to blend it in to what was there. And so that that doesn't look patched, I'm going to get more clear water and let it run into the petal on this side. A little bit more pigment. Now when that dries, hopefully it will look more like that petal is coming over the top of this petal, subtly, and just less of that petal is showing. I can start adding warm tones to the other parts of the painting. And I could add cool tones and have a whole different feeling. But in this case, I'm going to stick with the warmth of the tropical sun and the warmth on the leaves and on the petals of the flowers. So everything that I do for this part of it is going to be warm tone. And one area that I want to warm up are more of the leaves. So I'm going to mix more of the azo yellow. And these are more like glazes, but in some cases it'll be more than a glaze because I want a little more intensity to some of the colors. And in this case I need quite a bit of water because it's going to be a glaze. And I'm going to go over some of the areas to intensify the warmth of the color. Now it looks a little bit garish at this point, but that's okay. It'll tone down. Some of these leaves got a little cool looking, and it's fine to have some cool that are receding a little bit more. Some of them I want to be a little more vibrant because they're a little more toward the front. And the whole feeling I want is warm, tropical warmth. So I'm putting warm on top of cool. I'm going to leave those cool, except down here. They can be a little warmer. And I'm letting some of this bleed over into the background to unify it. Already the greens are warming up. Now I'm going to add a little bit of gamboge, which is a warmer yellow-orange, but very transparent, to vary the color a little. And some of this is too definite a brush stroke. So what I'm going to do to blend it in is I'm going to spray some of it. Spray it lightly and let the edges feather. I don't want to get next to the flowers because I'm trying to keep them dry. Now these are beginning to blend in more, and it has a much warmer look already. Back to my flat brush, and I'm going to put a little bit of the quinacridone red because it's a transparent red. I don't want too much of that color on my brush, but I want to have water and quinacridone red to blend that in. And in this case, I don't mind if I go right over the petal to blend it right in. Blend this in with the flower that was there. These are the flowers that are less important. I don't want to make them too prominent. Blend in some of this quinacridone red so that it is giving the whole glow of a tropical sunny day without defining anymore. It also helps to set the flowers apart wherever there's a contrast. Now that whole area to me has much more of a warm tropical glow, which is the gamboge with a little tiny bit of the quinacridone red. Now it's beginning to have more of the feeling of the tropics and the warm sun by adding warm tones. I still have the same colors, but I'm warming them up with glazes of warmth. Okay, on this side, I warmed up the background, so it has a feeling of warmth coming from behind. On this side, I'm going to put those warm tones into the flowers so that it looks like that sun is coming through the flowers. So I'm mixing the azo yellow again. I'm going to put a glaze of the azo on some of these petals to to make it appear as if some of that sun is sparkling through. Now if I put azo yellow where it's too violet, what I'm going to end up with is neutralizing it because they are complementary colors. I don't want to do that. So I'm trying to put the azo yellow where I lightened the petals and where the petals already have a little warmer tone. This is a perfect little spot right there for a little bit of sun to be showing through. Some perfect spots down here. So by warming it up, the whole painting takes on a feeling that it didn't have before, which is more the feeling that I started with. I wanted to paint the expression of the orchid, not the orchid in perfect detail. So it's not a direct representation, it is an expression of. I need very concentrated, saturated pigment. I can go ahead and leave a little bit of the yellow in it, that won't matter. But I'm really going for the darker tone. I want a very pointed brush and not too much pigment. What I want to do is give some definition to the shape of this center, because the center is just a beautiful little shape. And I've directed your attention to these flowers, to the center. So when you get there, I don't want you to be disappointed. You've made the journey to the center of the flower, so I want to make it worth your while. So there's a little treat to look at when you get there. You know, it's interesting to me that a lot of painters talk about needing rest areas in their painting. Restful, quiet, and busy areas. And when I think about it, I think that where the eye rests is where you have something that really grabs your attention and makes you want to stay there. So it's almost, to me, the opposite, where the place where there's the most interest would be where my eye would go and stay for a little rest. It makes the journey worthwhile. A little more definition in the centers. You can see how in that difference between ambiguity and specificity, it's just a matter of how much is just right for you. And you could keep going and have it totally defined, or you can stop along the way and say, that says it for me, that's enough. I remember now that there was a piece of stem that I forgot earlier. It was yellow, had a little bit of green on it. It doesn't take too much. But I'm going to put a little bit more of that into this part of it because it seems to have faded away as it dried. Watercolor will do that. As it dries, it gets lighter. Sometimes up to 40% lighter. So if it looks right when it's wet, it probably isn't quite as dark as you're going to want it to be when it dries. By waiting until I'm sure that it's completely dry, and then putting water right on that edge where the two colors are meeting, and then blotting it. And what that does, and if I do that a couple of times, it makes it look less like paint edge. It makes it look more like a natural edge. And so I could do some of that in a few places if I wanted. I think that was the only place that was really begging for me to do that. And as I look at it now, it has enough definition. It has the look of sunlight coming through the petals. It has the warmth of the tropical sun. It has all of those things that I set out to do. Here's another use for my test strips. I decide where I'm going to have my signature, and I line it up. I don't want it too close to the edge because if I'm going to mat the painting, then I don't want it to be too close to the edge. I want it to be in the painting but not in a place that's going to be very distracting. And I want it to be kind of straight. I have a feeling, and not everybody agrees with this, but I have a feeling that whatever the medium, and in this case it's media because I've used watercolor pencils as well, that the signature should stay in keeping with that. And so I like to sign watercolors with watercolor, and I like to sign pastels with pastel, and I like to sign oils with oil. Whatever I'm using, I like the signature to be the same. So I don't use an ink signature or a pencil signature on a watercolor, but that's just my feeling. So I'm going to practice for a minute. I'm going to get a color that goes with, and I don't think I'll use the red. I think I want to use the green and yellow because it'll fit with my background, not be too destructive to the design here or distracting. And I want to neutralize it a little bit so that it's not too intense and bright. But I want it to be dark enough that it's visible. All of those things. So when I get a color that feels right, then I'm going to test it over here. Now that seems like a pretty good color, but I think I want to just darken it with a little bit of the blue. Before I do it on the painting, I want to make sure that the load of paint on my brush is the right amount. So what I'll do is load up the brush with the color and then hold it pretty much vertically. This is the one time that I really prop my hand down, hold it vertically and practice. Think how many times you've written your name, and yet we still need to practice to make sure it's going to come out right. This is when I really want a Kolinsky sable brush that hangs on to enough paint so that I can make it to the end of my name without running out. Now, one last thing to do, just to check and see if it really looks finished. And the way to do that is to put it in a mat so that I can separate it from its environment. Sometimes partway through the painting, I'll slip it into a mat and it helps me to know if I'm finished or not. The mat itself separates it from all of the stuff, the paints, the brushes, the drawing board, and gives me a chance to just zero in on the painting. And I think it's finished. And thank you for joining me. I had the most fun making this painting, and I hope you'll have fun too. My name is Mark Mahaffey. Welcome to my video workshop. My name is Mark Mahaffey. Welcome to my video workshop. Hi, I'm Mark Mahaffey. Welcome to my video workshop. Try again. Flowing watercolor and doing a personal expression.
Try again.
Try again. It's getting worse.
Well, we know we have a good one.
That's good. Look down here. Okay, we'll do that part again. This happens to be a night blooming cereus, which is one of the most I'll start that again. This is a night blooming cereus. That's a cut. Oh, do I have to say cut?
No, you don't.